Welcome, everyone. I'm Suzanne Kanawi, Marketing Manager at the American University in Cairo Press. Thank you for joining us today for our virtual book discussion of Granada, the Complete Trilogy. Today's event will be around an hour, and we'll have room for Q&A at the end. So please, if you have questions, type them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen, or if you're joining from Facebook Live, type them in the comment box and we'll ask them on your behalf. We'll be discussing today, as I mentioned, Granada, the Complete Trilogy, written by the late and celebrated Egyptian novelist Radwa Ashour, who sadly passed away 10 years ago. Ashour's sweeping trilogy, set over 100 years against the backdrop of the great historical events of the 16th century Europe, tells the story of those who remained in Andalusia and of those individuals who struggled to maintain faith and hope in a possible future. It was named a top 100 literary work of the 20th century by the Arab Writers Union and is now available in a new complete translation in one book worldwide at major bookstores and online book sellers, and I'll be sharing also purchasing links in the chat box. We're delighted today to have with us the translator of the trilogy, Heikkinen, former Ibn Rushd Lecturer of Arabic at the University of Chicago and translator of many literary works, including Naguib Mahfouz in The Time of Love and Radwa Ashour's The Woman from Tantura. Also joining us today is our moderator, Marcia Lynx Qualey, founding editor of ArabiLit and ArabiLit Quarterly, and translator of Sonia Nim's Thunderbird Trilogy. Joining them in conversation is Sarah Enany, a literary translator and professor of English at the Cairo University and recipient of, professor in the English department of Cairo University and recipient of the Bani Pal Prize for Literary Translation. And finally, we have Mayte Green-Mercado, Associate Professor of History at Rutgers-Newark, where she teaches courses on Islamic history in Spain and North Africa. Please join me in welcoming our panelists. And now over to you, Marcia.
Thank you so much. And I also wanted to introduce the person who's not here today, Radwa Ashour, who died 10 years ago now, but her presence is still so widely and deeply felt, and particularly, I know, among all of us here. Radwa, for anyone here who does not know, Radwa was a scholar, a novelist, a critic, an activist, a memoirist, and a boundary-twining author. In the first part of her life, she focused on being a scholar, a mother, an activist, having decided in her early 20s that her literary writing wasn't good enough. But after experiencing severe health problems, she got back to writing in her late 30s, starting with her memoirs of being a PhD student in the US. And then at the end of her 30s, she published her first novel. It was the mid-90s when she brought out what would become her most celebrated work, which we're talking about today, the Granada Trilogy, which thanks to Kay is now finally out in a complete English translation. And so I just want to reiterate that at any point you have a question, you can put it in the chat, you can put it in the Q&A, put it wherever, we'll see it, and then we'll weave the questions in. But I wanted to start by talking about Radwa. Since this beautiful book didn't spring out of the ground, it was written by a beautiful person. And so, Sarah, I wanted to start with you. If you could talk a little about Radwa, her place in the Egyptian literary and cultural landscape. You are still muted.
Yes, sorry about that. Radwa is obviously a towering presence in the Egyptian literary tradition, and not only because of being a novelist. She would be a great novelist even if she were a man, which sounds wrong, but you know what I'm saying. It is the fact that she is also a female novelist and has achieved so much, such towering words. Like the sweep and the scope of her historical work is truly amazing. Her character work, her setting, and her historical accuracy is amazing. I actually did a little bit of research on historical novelists in Egypt. And it might be interesting to the audience to know that the first historical novelist in Egyptian history, as I can see it, was a woman. She was Aisha al-Taimuriya, who lived from 1850 to about 1904. Let me check my notes. And she wrote مرآة التأمل في الأمور, which is the mirror of contemplation of things, and it comprises a collection of stories from the Arabian Nights, which are set in a mysterious Arab past. We also have a rich history of historical novels. It's kind of, it used to be accepted that the first Arab novel was Zainab in 1914, but this is actually has been subsequently proved by scholars to be inaccurate because, for example, you have George Zidane, who wrote 22 historical novels between 1891 and 1914. You have Salim al-Bustani writing in 1871 historical novels again. You have Suhair al-Qalamawi, who is a very famous Egyptian, both journalist and author. And she wrote in the 1930s stories of my grandmother. Interestingly, a lot of this drama, I should say, this historical bent can be found in Arabic drama more than novels, or at least to an equal degree. The idea being that if you want to comment on despotic or unjust rule, it is very dangerous to be criticizing the current regime. But if you look at the past, you can then offer political criticism. But very interestingly, Radwa Ashour didn't offer that type of political. I mean, you have that in The Sultan's Dilemma of Alfred Farag, which is a play. You have all sorts of blood on the Kaaba. You have the tragedy of Al-Hallaj. There is a lot of dramatic work that does these historical sort of references. But what Radwa does is she sort of cuts through to the more human element beyond the historical background, so that she's very much in the tradition of, I compare her to Pearl Buck, sort of. If you've read The Good Earth, it's very much like that novel with that sort of historical sweep and that scope, but at the same time, the characters are very relatable and one can actually see oneself in them. Her historical accuracy has been lauded by a lot of people. She's been praised by a lot of people because, in fact, there have been, Naguib Mahfouz famously got some ancient Egyptian history wrong in one of his books. And Ali Ahmed Bakathir also got some Arab history wrong in some of his books. And in fact, we do have a tradition, if I may say briefly, in Arabic literature, of taking literary works as historical references. If we look at what they call Ummahat al-Kutub, the mother books, or sort of the authoritative sources of early Islam, you will find very few dates and you will find a great deal of anecdotal references. So those are almost novels in a way, but they are taken as historical references. So the whole thing of playing fast and loose with history is something that Radwa Ashour could very well have fallen into, but she didn't. She ended up being extremely accurate historically. And that combination of historical accuracy and really captivating character and really captivating plot, and so that we care what happens to the people beyond just reading history. I think that's truly remarkable. And I am not going to go into detail, but I was trying to compile a list of people who followed in Radwa Ashour's footsteps and wrote historical novels. And I found a huge list. A huge list. You have, starting in the 2000s, you have Rawiya Rashid's play about Ibn Rumi. You have Yusuf Zidane's Azazel, which was quite famous because it won the International Prize for Arabic Fiction. You have the Red other read a copy of the Quran. You have the Hashashin play. You have Salwa Bakr's The Man from Bashmur, which is in Arabic al-Bashmuri. You have The Girl with Braided Hair. You have Hashashin, on and on and on. So I would say that Radwa Ashour really sort of sparked a renaissance of the historical novel with her amazing trilogy, because after she had done that, what actually occurred was that the historical novel became not merely a way to reflect modern political issues, but became much more contemplative as to where have we come from and where are we going. And I think that's a good place to end any comments on her here.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to kind of blow up this quote. She would be a great novelist even if she were a man. Kay, I would like to turn now to you. And for you to talk about your relationship with Radwa and her work, since you've also translated it into Suraya, how that journey came to be.
Well, what can I say after that wonderful quotation from Sara? So I was fortunate enough to meet both Dr. Radwa and the trilogy when I was a very, very, very non-traditional student in CASA at the beginning of the 2000s. I was in a class with Professor Nadia Harb, and she knew Dr. Radwa and brought her to class and had her talk about the trilogy, which was relatively, I think it had just been completed just about that time. And I was very interested in it because I had once studied Al-Andalus in my pre history. I hadn't studied this period. I had studied something much earlier, but I thought, okay, I have to read this. I have to read this right now, and I did. Although right now took a while for me, especially at that time. And then when I knew Faru, and Faru Abdul Wahab encouraged me to try my hand at translating. I thought, okay, what I really want to translate is Maryam. And I did a sample for that, for the press actually, which turned out to be underwhelming, but it gave me a chance to do some other translations for the press. And then there was an opportunity, which later fell apart, but there was an opportunity for an anthology of short stories from Arab women. And I had loved her Taqarira Sayyida Ra, the reports of Mrs. R. So I translated a couple of those, and Faru, because he knew her, was willing to send them to her and ask her approval or for permission for me to submit them. He believes, by the way, she had apparently been when they were all young. He knew both her and Murid al-Baghouthi. And he always believed that they met in his class, Allahu Alam. But he believed that firmly. Anyway, he sent her the stories and she liked them. And so then when Atamturiya appeared, and I was even more enthusiastic about being able to translate that, she very kindly gave her permission. And not only that, she truly held my hand with the translation, for which I am eternally grateful. She saved me from some mistakes that I don't remember, fortunately, but I know she did, and suggested things. And I was thinking to myself, wait a minute, her English is every bit as good as mine. Is there a reason for me to be doing this? But I did, and I was very grateful to have that opportunity. So I'll stop there for now.
Thanks so much, Kay. And so, Mayte, I want to turn to you now. And I think probably everybody here knows that many people read Palestine into this trilogy, but it is, as Sara said, very much full of the sort of felt details and lived life as we know it of the 15th and 16th century. Obviously, I cannot verify this, in Spain and North America. And so, Mayte, I would love if you could set the scene for us about the time in which this book is set, why this time, what it offers as a window onto humanity, what it tells us about the then and the now.
Yes, thank you, Marcia. And I want to thank once again Kay for this invitation. I got to Radwa Ashour also through Farouk, who in third year Arabic encouraged me to read the full three books, and I just got to read them through Kay's translation. So I really appreciate this. So the book begins at a moment of great excitement, anxiety, and turmoil in the Iberian Peninsula and beyond its borders. Book one is set at a time that historians have identified it as a moment of a break of the so-called convivencia between Muslims, Christians, and Jews after centuries of coexistence that was not always peaceful. In the late 14th and 15th centuries, religious minorities in the Iberian Peninsula increasingly saw their existence as religious and political communities under threat. And this she captures very well. So as we know, in 1391, there were pogroms against Jews that resulted in the mass conversion of this community to Christianity. And for Muslims, the fall of Granada in 1492, this had been the last Muslim political presence in the peninsula after a 10-year, pretty brutal war, represented a catastrophe, not only for those Muslims who were living in Granada, but for Muslims in the rest of the peninsula. And we have testimonies of mudéjars and moriscos reflecting on the fall of Granada as a catastrophe and as as divine punishment for the community's sins. So this is sort of the setting for the beginning of the novel, but 1492, as we know, was also the year when Jews were expelled from the Iberian Peninsula. This was the same year of Columbus's voyage. And so this was a moment when people who were living at this time thought that they were living at the end of times. And in fact, Ferdinand and Isabella were viewed by many, including Columbus, as sort of these messianic rulers who would rule at the end of times. And so this was a period in which the toleration of religious minorities and of other religious presence in the Iberian Peninsula had ended. And it was a new era of forced conversion and forced assimilation. And so the novel captures both these early beginnings and also the 100 years of Morisco history, or the history of this community of Muslims who were forced to convert to Catholicism and were later expelled in 1609. Less evident in book one, but very present in books two and three, are this Ottoman Habsburg imperial competition for the control of the Mediterranean. And the novel presents these Moriscos not only as spectators of this conflict between the Ottomans and the Habsburgs, but actually as political or participants, active participants in this political life of the Mediterranean, which I think is really interesting and something that is very dear to my heart because I've investigated this. So this is a history of empires. It's a history of defeat. It's the history of conquest and colonization and of dispossession. And it is a moment when we begin to see the racialization of religious and ethnic minorities in the Iberian Peninsula. It's a novel, or it's a period, a historical moment about the experiences of those who were forcibly assimilated, who were subjugated and ultimately expelled from their homelands. And it is also, and I think she also captures it well in this novel, a story of political agency, of the importance of community and of resistance in the face of subjugation and injustice. Eric Calderwood recently has reminded us that this novel and this period that is being explored serves as a cautionary tale of the perils of a community that divided, but also as a symbol of resistance and of resilience. And so I think this history that is being told in these novels gives us a glimpse into the past, but also I can't help, or we can't help to think about the genocide that is unfolding from our phones and our TVs.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, of course, they wouldn't have used the word genocide at the time. It was not, but it's impossible, I think, to read the whole scope of this and not from the beginning to people having to hide their identities to the forced marches. It's impossible for us as contemporary readers, I think, not to come to that word. So Sarah talked about the accuracy of this book and how this book sort of cleaves to the time. And I wondered if you could tell us how you assess something like that as somebody who's in a position to do so.
I mean, I think I mentioned before we started the webinar, I was reading all three books, and sometimes I would burst out laughing, thinking, how did she write this? What was she reading? And how is it possible that she is making these references that don't necessarily appear in the history books that she might have been reading at the time? I was really astonished and kind of thought at times, did she write my book before I wrote it? Because her historical accuracy is quite astonishing. So some of the themes of the novel that I see very clearly in the historical record are themes that relate to Morisco resistance, preservation of culture, and also making sense of loss and dispossession. And so these are stories that she weaves very nicely into her narrative, but that we can also actually see in Inquisition sources, in diplomatic correspondence and chronicles of the time. So in my estimation, and I have to say, I have to preface all of this by saying that I don't usually read historical novels as a historian, but that I feel very fortunate that I had the opportunity to read these three books. She weaves these descriptions in the dialogues and mentions historical figures in the narrative, but is really accurate about the references that she's making. So she's talking about events that are very famous, such as the burning of the books in Birrambla, which we all know about, the Edict of Conversion, the Alpujarras revolt, the requests of the Moriscos to the Ottoman Sultan and to the Mamluk Sultan. So it reflects deep familiarity with historical sources. But I find it really interesting that there are more obscure references that she makes that are elements that are only found in historical sources. And that to me is really fascinating. Sources that I've looked at. For example, there is a moment in the novel where one of the characters goes to the Americas. And then she weaves a whole story of his experience in the Americas. So the historical accuracy of this moment could be called into question. It could be said, oh, there were prohibitions against Muslims and Jews to go to the Americas. But we do know, and I've written about this, and there are others who have written about this, that Inquisition sources tell us that Moriscos embarked on such voyages. I have a source that I analyze in my book about a Morisca seer through magical practices who it has a conversation with a Morisco who goes to see this woman and to ask whether her husband will come back from the Americas. He's been away for a long time and she doesn't know what his fate is. And this seer tells the woman that her husband has gone and will come back as a very rich man. So these are the kinds of things that our Inquisition sources tell us, and that it could very well be part of the dialogue that Radwa Ashour brings to us. But there are other sources on page or on book 2. Radwa Ashour tells us about the figure of this Mahdi figure of Al-Fatimi who is going to come back riding on his green horse. And this is something that appears in some historical sources, but that is not something that is written in history books. Today, I write about it in an article, but that she knows about these snippets of information of Morisco history. So the one last thing that I'll say that I think is brilliant is her ability to capture the ruptures and fissures within Morisco community that are very perceptive, is something that really accurately portrays Morisco society of the time. And so I kind of want to go back and try to see what she was reading, not to probe her historical accuracy, but rather to really find out where was she getting this information from? Where was she learning about Morisco history and from whom? It was very exciting for me as a historian who's written on these things to read her work.
Yeah, another thing I find extraordinary about it is some historical novels fall into this trap of, in order to make the characters relatable, as Sarah said, because one of the important things about this is that we do care so deeply about these characters. They give them sort of more contemporary views. So they might, make the characters more feminist than they really, than is believable for them to be. But these characters also have the, you find them doing unsavory things that they might have not felt were unsavory at the time.
Absolutely. I mean, I'll give you a quick example. She talks about this character, this girl who has been killed by her family or by the male figures in her family. I actually have an Inquisition source where the same thing is happening. And so through her dialogues, one hears voices, Morisco voices that one very well could read in other historical sources. And I think that's really remarkable.
The one thing I wondered about, so as I said, some people, of course, read Palestine into this, and it's in some ways impossible not to. There is this moment like Spaniards are in the street chanting death to Arabs. And I just wondered, did that really happen? Or is that like, are there some contemporary imports there?
I would say that is probably, well, I mean, they might not have been chanting this, but in autos de fe, for example, in these ceremonies that were held after the conclusion of Inquisition trials, these were public ceremonies. And there were Moriscos there witnessing, and there were Christians there witnessing, and it could get rather violent. In fact, one of the cases that I study, there was a man, Morisco leader, who on the day that he went before the auto de fe, he was going to be sentenced to death. And before he died, a group of people, because he died raising his finger, and saying that he wanted to live and die as a Moor or as a Muslim, the crowds that were around him ended up stoning him. The Christian crowds that were around him ended up stoning him to death. So there was actually a lot of public violence against Moriscos. So yes, I would say that might be accurate in different ways, expressed in different ways, but yes.
So I'd also like to talk about teaching with this book, because I think, you know, some people in the audience are just reading the book for themselves, and some people might be using it in the classroom. And I wanted to start back with Kay, and what ways you think this might fit into a literature, literary translation, a translation course, what books you see it might being in conversation with, what elements you might look at.
Thank you, Marcia. If you don't mind, I'd like to go back just a minute to what Mayte was saying, because one of the things that we had talked about was how this looks at the history of the Spanish conquest of the Americas not through centering, you know, American history. And that's something I particularly noticed as I was reading and working on this, that of course Christopher Columbus considered that he was carrying on the great mission of the Catholic kings, and this book really portrays the horror and the cruelty of the conquest in South America as a continuation of the Reconquista in Spain. And I remember many years ago reading in Spanish a diary from a Spanish priest about, in fact, the horrors of the early conquest, and thinking, wow, it sounds as if Radwa has read this exact same thing. So I wanted to add that. In terms of teaching, so most of my experience is as a language teacher. So I've had, you know, very little opportunity to engage with literature classes. Maybe Sara or Mayte could tell us a little more about that. But just in thinking about it, I mean, it certainly has its place as a feminist work. If one were studying, you know, modern feminist Arab writers and Arab literature, then you could certainly include this in that. I mean, with the strong female characters like Salima and Maryam, and even, you know, and others too, but particularly those two, it definitely has its place. Also, and then also with the element of the honor killing that comes up in the third book that Mayte mentioned. Also, more broadly, though, it's a cry against oppression, and I mean, as we've alluded to, you know, up until now. So it could be placed, if one were doing a class about prison literature or literature of oppression or literature of resistance, it could certainly be placed in with things like Abdurrahman Munif's Shar al-Mutawassit, or other books of prison literature, or as well as, of course, anything that deals with Palestine and you know, the long tradition of Palestinian literature. So that would be on the more literary side. In terms of translation, I think some of the challenges that I had and that I would present to a class, because of course that's what you do, right? You get solutions from your students. You present them with your problems, and their brilliant minds think of things. One is the constant problem in Arabic translation of time, which we all know about, right? The Arabic uses a great deal of the present when it's clearly referring to the past. And how do you deal with that and keep the freshness of the tone and yet make the tenses all work? And then another is the tone, because you want to keep it appropriate to the time in which the historical novel is set, but you don't want it to sound like the King James Bible, unless there's a quotation from the King James Bible. And I did use King James for one biblical quotation. And I used an older Quran translation as well. I used the Arbery one for that reason. But in general, you want the tone to be something that's easily taken in by a reader, but that doesn't violate what is there. And you want to make the difference between, say, the formal fatwa and that kind of tone, and then everyday conversation. and that can be a challenge. Also, just voices. How do you reflect the kids and the old people and get them right and make them authentic without caricaturing them in that way? And then also then just in little things, that everyday food or dress or expressions, religious expressions, things that are not as natural in our own culture. How do we bring that across without too much foreignizing? At least I don't believe in a great deal of foreignizing, because I want to invite the readers in. I don't want to make them work too hard. But at the same time, I assume that part of the readership will be Arabs or other Muslims who know the culture very well. And so you want to make things recognizable for them. So you don't want to familiarize them to the point of erasure. So those are some of the challenges that that I faced in translation. One last thing is, a translator friend of mine recently talked about what's visible in a language and what's invisible. And I think that's maybe our greatest challenge. We want to bring a text with what was visible in the original, still visible in the translation, without being too cluttered by things that just won't be seen by an Arab reader who's reading the original. So all of these, yes, students, please solve these for me.
Thank you, Kay. So, Sara, what about you? If you were, for me, now that we've started to have this conversation, I think there would be a fantastic course in literature that decenters U.S. history, that looks at U.S. history, parts of U.S. history from putting U.S. at the margins. But Sara, I would love to hear your thoughts.
Well, I was really quite taken with Kay's line, what she just said, familiarizing to the point of erasure. And that's interesting. If I can just take my name as an example. I'm bilingual. I was raised bilingual. And if I'm speaking English, I say Sarah. Sarah like Sarah. And then if I'm speaking Arabic, but if somebody is speaking English and they call me Sarah, it's wrong to me. It's like, what's going, who is this person? I don't know this person. And for this reason, I've always fallen a little bit more on the domestication side. And I realized, and actually this was an argument that I had with the wonderful Neil Hewison, who worked at AUC at the time, because I would, for example, I've told you, I've told you a dozen times, and I've done this dozens of times, and he would tell me, why don't you say tens of times? And I tell him, because we don't say tens of times in English, and that kind of thing is actually really interesting. I have an MA student, we were talking about this in the classroom, right? So I have an MA student who actually interviewed Kay about the translation of common phrases and maxims and axioms and sayings in Arabic, and how they would be transferred to English using the Christian Nord's method of functional translation. That is, because, for example, in Arabic, you have the word itfaddal, which literally means do the honors. And itfaddal, it can mean sit down. It can mean get out. It can mean please join us at the table for a meal. It can say here you are. It can mean here. So for me, if I said do the honors, I would be doing violence to the meaning. It is really about, and there's lots of things like this. For example, I like to translate. Some people will say la hawla wa la quwwata illa billah, which means literally there is no power but of God. No power or strength but in God. And if it's said in context, I will do it if it's done in a context where some disaster. Yes, it can mean lead the way, Olivia. Yes, that's we're getting someone, Carol Abu Musa, saying in chat, it can mean stand up. It can mean lead the way. It can mean leave me alone. Absolutely, it can mean it can mean a million things. But to go back, if I'm saying this in English, I might say something like, "Oh, thy will be done," which we say when there's a disaster or when something horrible happens. And the reason for this, okay, I will just say this one thing. I do not want to waste everybody's time, but I will say one thing. I think this debate with familiarization and foreignization is very nice and applicable when you are talking about English and French, let's say, which are practically the same anyway, if you're an Arabic speaker. Yes, we're getting a lot of nice personal anecdotes from the audience. Thank you so much for that. Sorry, what was I saying? I do have ADHD, so forgive me. What was I saying? Is someone going to tell me what I was saying?
You were saying about foreignization and domestication.
Foreignization and domestication. Yeah. What I'm saying is that if you do everything in your power to domesticate an Arabic text, it is still going to be foreignized, no matter what you do. And I think for this reason, I am not really afraid of over-domesticating an Arabic text, because I am pretty sure that whatever else I do, there's going to be the mahr, which is the dowry. And nobody uses a dowry nowadays, but we do. And you're going to get the parents, all these cultural things. I think we already start out from a great place of foreignization that isn't really shared by, if you're translating into and from Romance languages. And to tie this back to Granada in the classroom, I do think that looking at things like this, especially from a historical perspective as well, because you have here a distance not only in language, but you have a distance in time as well, and a distance in place. So you actually are sort of thrice distanced. And bridging all those gaps with students, as Kay said, you have the time period. So how does the language reflect that? You have the whole Morisco element. You have the fact that it's in Arabic. So it really is a difficult gap for a translator to bridge. And there have been a lot of, I will just say something really quickly, that we have a lot of MA and PhD students. We do not have as many undergraduates approaching Granada, but we have a lot of them turning to it when it comes time for postgraduate studies. That's I'll conclude with that.
Thank you so much. So I think one last question before we turn to the audience. Mayte, I would love to know how you might think about placing this as a literary work in a history class.
Thank you, Marcia, and thank you, Sarah, for ending with that thought of the undergraduate teaching at the undergraduate level. A few years ago, and this was quite a while ago, I used to teach in a literature department, and I taught a course on the history of Al-Andalus through Arab and Muslim literature and film. I mean, this was at the undergraduate level. Mm-hmm. I used the translation that was available at the time, and I read it, this text alongside Tariq Ali's Shadow of the Pomegranate Tree, which is set around the same time. I also, of course, use and still in my Al-Andalus classes, Mahmoud Darwish's poetry, and I used Yusuf Shaheen's Destiny film on Ibn Rushd. And so what I was trying to do as a historian teaching a class in literature was to teach them history through this literature, and I thought that it was very effective. In fact, I would say that the undergraduates were drawn to Radwa Ashour's book the most, which is heartening. But if I had to teach it again in a history department, I think I would be really interested in reading this book, on the one hand, alongside Eric's book, that can help us sort of anchor and give sort of historical context to more recent histories. But on the other hand, to study this history alongside primary sources and to kind of do that reading of looking at the primary sources and then looking at the historical text, maybe thinking about what this novel what are the ways in which this novel can enrich our understanding of history or bring to light issues that are not always evident in our historical sources, voices that are left out in the historical record, for example, the voices of women, and do that kind of back and forth of looking at the literature to help us fill in gaps that our historical record is leaving out, not to distort the history, but just to give a little bit of room to the imagination. I think it would be very useful for our students and in a
Yeah,
much more engaging, exciting way for them.
Very
yeah,
much.
absolutely, because we are pretty sure that women lived at the time, whether or not their voices are in the historical record. Actually, I lied. So before we turn to questions, I want to just give Kay a chance to say anything more that's come up from this discussion.
Oh, just one thing that I haven't mentioned that I thought I should. When I first did meet Dr. Radwa, I remember that she talked about the trilogy as a sketch for writing later about Palestine. And I thought to myself, wow, so often in the encounters that I had had in Arabic literature, Andalus was a paradise. It was the lost paradise. And maybe you would be very critical of the rulers for losing it, or maybe it would just be elegiac mode. But this was looking at it as human experience, lived human experience, and taking from it something that could be useful in thinking about contemporary things. And of course, that's before we even knew about what's going on now. But that's exactly what she did with The Woman from Tantura, with Tanturia, which is one reason I was so interested in translating that when I had the chance to do it. So that's all I want. That's all.
Thank you so much, Kay. And Mayte, sorry, I also had wanted, I think we know that you meant, oh, you wrote, okay. If you could just say for everyone that you meant Eric Calderwood's.
Oh, yes, I'm sorry. I did mean Eric Calderwood's recent book on Earth or in poems, The Afterlives of Al-Andalus.
Thank you. Just for the people who are watching this later. So we'll start with Yomna's question, which is, first, can we pinpoint the exact sources that Ashour consulted in her research? Did she, for example, have access to any archival materials, especially ones revolving around the Inquisition trials? What can we say now with not having her around anymore about what sources she used?
I really want to do this, take on this project now. I'm very serious. I think it's really exciting to go back to the novel and start trying to piece together what she might have been reading, because I believe that in a lecture, I read something recently where she was saying that she was taking on the role of chronicling and looking at chronicles. So I really am curious as to what she was reading, and I'm not sure, but I think it's worth doing that research.
And this was a time before the internet as well.
Exactly.
Yes, which
I mean,
that's an
I
important
think
consideration.
I suspect that she was reading, of course, Harvey's book and Anwar Shejne's book and maybe Lee's book on the history of the Moriscos, their conversion and their expulsion. But a lot of the sources that she is kind of that resonate with things that I've read were not translated and not easily available. I'm wondering, does anyone know if she read Spanish?
I believe
I don't know.
I believe she was, at least by the end of this, she was able to get along a bit in Spanish. I was struck by things that I've seen. I don't know how I tripped over it, but the fatwa that's included that comes from North Africa, I know I've seen that in articles, in journals.
Yeah.
So she was obviously bringing together a great group.
She was doing serious research before writing this. That's very obvious.
Yeah, I mean, I think it takes, so I had just wanted to mention, I don't know if people are aware, the Egyptian author Mohammed Saif al-Nasr brought out a book this year that is set in the same time period. Then he sent prophets. And when I was asking about it, he said he read about 200 different manuscripts and historical texts in order to grapple with this time. I think, to do it well, maybe that's kind of what it takes.
And if I can just say one last thing on this is that she's not just focusing on the moment of the fall of Granada. She really is writing a history of the Moriscos as a community from the conquest of Granada and their conversion to their expulsion. This is 100 years of history that she's weaving into this novel, and she does so, I think, quite successfully.
So I want to take this question from Malik, who is an MA student at the ECLT department at AUC, writing a thesis on the theme of exile, and one of the works is Granada. Malik says, my approach is comparative literature and religion. This is my question is, when translating bits of the novel where religion is foregrounded, how did you face the challenge of translating the religious and cultural connotations when they're portrayed in such a multifaceted, multi-layered way by both the author and even the characters themselves as they grapple with their own religion and identity? You've been mentioning domestication and formalization as a constant debate. Where did you lean in the most in a novel that's very much sort of grounded in culture and religion?
Oh my. As I said, we leave these things to our students to solve for us, right? I don't know the answer to that, except that the one thing I wanted to do was to be aware of it whenever I came to places like that, to realize what I was doing. And, the expressions such as Sarah mentioned about la hawla wa la quwwata illa billah, sometimes as a friend of mine who's a translator here from Arabic says, it just means, damn it. It can, depending on the context, it can mean so many different things. So what my approach tends to be walking close to the wall, as I think the Egyptian expression is. I tend to want to stay pretty close to the original voices until I feel as if they're not going to sound right to the English reader. So I'm always just doing a balancing act, and it's very intuitive for me. I don't have a good intellectual defense for what I've done with it. You'll tell me whether it works.
Okay, a question from...
Could I jump in and say something very quickly about this? And I am not a translator, but I am thinking, as a historian who works with Alhamiado sources, what the Moriscos were doing, which was some Moriscos who didn't know Arabic, who couldn't write in Arabic, was that they were writing in Alhamiado. This is Spanish written in Arabic characters, but the religious terms they left in Arabic. And so I'm wondering in the translation whether one can sort of capture, without distorting too much, of course, the text, that way of thinking and writing of Moriscos when they were expressing religious terminology, perhaps leaving it in the Arabic and then translating it. I don't know. That's just something that comes to mind. But it's a really great question.
I should have talked to you first.
Oh. The other thing that I guess I didn't mention before, and I mean, I think the novel is very historically accurate, but one thing I think is a little bit problematic is that the idea that these were Arabs that is constant, I mean, the Arabness of Moriscos, I think is just too emphasized too much, when at times our sources, Moriscos are identifying themselves as Moors or as something else and not necessarily as Arabs is something that I forgot to say before, but I'll just leave it there.
It's interesting.
Yeah, so I think we have time for one more question. So I'm going to take Ali's. Sorry to everybody else. Ali Jamri says, I noticed recently in a trip to the Gulf and browsing in a bookshop that there seems to be a whole genre of Arabic historical fiction set in Andalus. We heard about Granada's impact on historical fiction in Arabic, but specifically what was its impact on Andalusi literature, and are there novels since Granada set in Andalus that you would consider important? I guess this is for anybody.
Well, you mentioned one just now, Marcia.
I read one that was published this year that I found pretty remarkable, and actually Muhammad also talks about that thing that Mayte just referred to, about how much there was an identity of Spanish Muslim that they didn't necessarily see themselves as part of this sort of broader ummah, but as specifically Spanish Muslims. And I found that work to be, he talked about over researching, he traveled to Spain to see the sites that he, and to see what the light was like at a particular hour. It's his first novel, so he didn't want to screw it up.
What is his last name again?
He's Muhammad Saif al-Nasr, and it's Then He Sent Prophets. And I don't know if we can include this maybe we should include a few things, Eric Calderwood's book and other things in the email that we send out after the participants. I don't know if anybody else wants to.
I don't have something direct to add to this, and if anybody else does, you should. I just want to say that I have the feeling that Andalus was always sort of the cheerful, comfortable, nice subject that within the Arab realm more. And that's one thing that I think Radwa does here, is she breaks that a bit. She's saying, okay, I'm not talking about the gardens, and I'm not talking about the magnificent parties that were thrown at Zahra or Zahira or these other palaces that were built. I'm talking about ordinary people and how they live their lives and the effect of power and world events on them. So I feel as if that itself marked a shift in the view of Andalus within the Arab world. But perhaps I'm wrong, and maybe someone else has more ideas.
Well, I think we'll wrap up. So, Sara, do you have any final remarks bits of wisdom that you want to share with us? Or Sarah, sorry, we're speaking English.
That's right. Well, that's the best final remark, I think. I'm good.
All right. And Mayte?
Once again, to thank you all for this wonderful conversation and for the opportunity to participate, and to everyone who came.
Yes, thank you so much. And I think we should actually save down this chat, which has some valuable discussion in it.
Yes.
Let me save it. Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Marcia, so much for moderating this event. And thank you to all of our panelists for this wonderful conversation. I'm sure everyone found it as enjoyable as I did. I'm personally very honored to share this living legacy of Radwa Ashour. I wish she was with us. She would have enjoyed this discussion as much as we did. But again, I'd like to remind everyone that they can order their copy of Granada, the Complete Trilogy. You'll find it in major bookstores worldwide and online book retailers. And you'll find it on our website with purchasing links, aucpress.com. And the recording of this discussion will be available shortly on AUC Press Facebook and YouTube channel if you missed anything or you want to go back to it. But again, sincere thank you to our panelists. You made today very enjoyable, and also to everyone who joined us. Marcia, would you like to say final few words?
No, just thank you to everyone. And yes, in honor of Radwa, always.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.
Thank you, Susan.